My name is Abby. I am 21 years old, a third-year sociology student, a-time barista at a boutique coffee collective, and currently a strategic ethics intern at a mid-sized digital consultancy firm called Synergy Path Solutions. I don't just live life, I audit it. To me, every interaction is a data point, every conversation is a negotiation of power, and every shared space is a laboratory where the fossils of the patriarchy are still very much alive and twitching. I spend my days analyzing the emotional labor I am forced to expend on people who haven't read a single page of radical theory, and my nights documenting these microaggressions in a digital archive I call the Daily Patriarchy Report. At the coffee shop, I watch the way men take up space, the manspreading on the vintage velvet chairs, the way they assume I am an extension of the espresso machine rather than a human being with a complex internal map. I've become an expert at the radical coldness, a specific tone of voice that provides the service required by my contract, but refuses to offer the performative warmth that men feel entitled to. If a man smiles at me and tells me to cheer up, I don't smile back. I ask him to define the sociological basis of his expectation for my emotional labor. Usually, they just blink, take their oat milk latte, and retreat. That is a victory. It is a small, bitter victory, but in a world built on the structural silencing of voices like mine, I take what I can get. My internship at Synergy Path Solutions was supposed to be my foray into corporate ethical restructuring. I wanted to see if I could dismantle the master's house using the master's own HR tools. The office was located in a converted industrial warehouse, all exposed brick, polished concrete, and collaborative open-plan seating. In my eyes, it was a panopticon, a space designed for constant surveillance under the guise of transparency. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning during a culture alignment meeting. The CEO of Synergy Path, a man named Marcus who wore expensive t-shirts and spoke in a dialect of growth mindsets and vulnerability, stood at the front of the room. Marcus considered himself an ally. He liked to use terms like inclusive synergy, which I recognized as a linguistic mask for neoliberal exploitation. Team, Marcus said, clasping his hands together. I've been looking at the data, and I've been feeling the energy in this room. We've become a collection of islands. I see everyone hunched over their desks, wearing noise-canceling headphones, lost in their own little worlds. We're losing the magic of the in-between moments. The spontaneous sparks of innovation that happen when we just talk. I sat in the back, my notebook open, my pen hovering. I wrote, *subject M is attempting to colonize the internal silence of the workforce. He views the private auditory space as a barrier to total cognitive extraction, *. So, Marcus continued, oblivious to my scribbling. Starting Monday, we are implementing a sound of success policy. No more headphones in the main work area. We want to foster a culture of radical availability. If you're in the office, you're here for the team. If you need to focus, learn to focus through the hum of collaboration. Let's hear each other again. A silence fell over the room, but it wasn't the good, kind Marcus wanted. It was a heavy, stunned silence. To my left, I saw the software development team, a group of 4 men and 1 woman who lived and breathed in a world of logic, syntax, and deep concentration. Caleb, the lead developer, looked like he had just been told his oxygen supply was being rationed. Caleb was the quintessential tech bro, though a quieter version. I had already filed him under benign but complicit in my mental directory because of the way he assumed everyone knew what a Git pull request was without explaining it, a clear sign of intellectual gatekeeping. Marcus, Caleb said, his voice hesitant. A lot of us, we need the headphones to code. It's about flow state. The office is loud. The AC hums, the coffee machine grinds, people are on sales calls. Without the music, it's hard to stay in the zone. Marcus smiled, that paternalistic, I know better than you smile that I've seen on every man from my father to my professors. Caleb, buddy, flow is just another word for a silo. We don't want silos. We want a symphony. Try it for a week. You'll find that the ambient energy of the office actually fuels your creativity. I watched Caleb's jaw tighten. I noted, Asterisk, the masculine ego struggles when its sanctuary of logic is threatened by the very social structures it claims to have built. Caleb's resistance is not just about productivity, it is a territorial dispute over his cognitive environment. Asterisk. Monday arrived like a funeral for focus. The first thing I noticed was the noise. It wasn't a symphony, it was a cacophony of domestic and professional violence. The sales team, located just 10 feet from the developers, were high-energy hunters. They shouted into their headsets, laughed loudly at jokes that weren't funny, and rang a literal brass bell every time they closed a deal. I sat at my intern desk, trying to compile a report on inclusive onboarding metrics, but every 3 seconds, my brain was hijacked. Yeah, we can scale that by Q3. Did you see the game last night? Cling, the bell. Someone was chewing ice. Someone else was tapping a pen on a metal desk. I looked over at the developers. It was a massacre of the mind. Caleb was staring at his monitor, his hands hovering over the keyboard, but he wasn't typing. His eyes were darting toward the sales desk every time someone laughed. Leo, another coder, was trying to use earplugs, but Marcus had walked by and jokingly pulled one out, saying, "Earplugs are just headphones for the timid, Leo. Join they." By Wednesday, the tension in the office was a physical weight. The radical availability Marcus wanted had turned into chronic interruption. Because people couldn't signal they were busy by wearing headphones, everyone felt entitled to walk up to anyone at any time. "Hey, Caleb, quick question about the API," a junior marketing coordinator said, tapping him on the shoulder. Caleb jumped, his glasses nearly sliding off his nose. I'm right in the middle of a security patch, Sarah. I can't. It'll just take a second, she insisted, leaning over his shoulder, her perfume clouding his face. I watched Caleb's face turn a shade of frustrated gray. This was the emotional labor I talked about, though Caleb didn't have the vocabulary to name it. He was being forced to manage Sarah's feelings while his own professional output was being decimated. I felt a strange, fleeting moment of empathy for him, which I immediately suppressed. He was still a beneficiary of the system. His current suffering was merely a temporary glitch in his privilege. I decided to use this as a case study for my sociology thesis, The Auditory Panopticon: How Forced Collaboration Functions as a Mechanism of Neoliberal Surveillance and the Erosion of the Intellectual Commons. I began interviewing my coworkers under the guise of HR feedback. How does the lack of auditory boundaries impact your sense of self-agency? I asked Leo. Leo looked at me with bloodshot eyes. I've written the same line of code 6 times, Abby. I can hear Marcus eating an apple from 20 feet away. It sounds like a bone snapping. I'm going insane. Interesting, I said, writing. Subject L reports sensory fragmentation and a breakdown of the barrier between the public and the visceral. The data was undeniable. By the end of the first week, the Project Alethea, a massive, multi-million-dollar software integration for a client called Vesper Global, was falling behind. Usually, the developers would put in 12-hour days in a focused trance. Now, they were leaving at 5:01 p.m., looking drained and defeated. On Thursday, I was in the break room making a double-shot espresso when Marcus walked in, looking energized. The energy is palpable, isn't it, Abby? You can really feel the pulse of the company now. I looked him dead in the eye. If by pulse, you mean the synchronized cortisol spikes of 40 people unable to complete a coherent thought, then yes, Marcus. It's very palpable. He chuckled, dismissing me. You're a firebrand, Abby. I love that. Radical honesty ice off the sound of success. He didn't get it. He was a top-down thinker. He didn't have to produce anything. He spent his day in meetings where talking was the work. He couldn't conceive of a world where silence was the raw material of value. He was a predator of other people's focus. The following Tuesday, the symphony turned into a tragedy. Vesper Global was expecting a beta demonstration of the new platform. This project was the backbone of Synergy Path's revenue for the year. If it failed, the company wouldn't just lose a client, it would lose its reputation. I was sitting near the dev pod when Caleb finally snapped. He had been trying to debug a critical error for 3 hours. Beside him, the sales lead, a man named Brian, was retelling a story about a bachelorette in Vegas, complete with sound effects. And then the guy, Brian, roared with laughter, slamming his hand on the desk. Caleb stood up so fast his chair flipped over. The crash of the chair silenced the entire room. "Shut up!" Caleb screamed. His face was purple. "Just shut the hell up for 5 minutes." Brian froze. Marcus emerged from his glass office, looking concerned. "Caleb, hey, let's take a breath." "What's the what is that? I can't think." Caleb shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus. "You want synergy? You want collaboration? Here's some collaboration. The code is broken. The database is corrupted because I got distracted while running a migration script, and I don't know how to fix it because I can't hear my own thoughts. We're going to fail the Vesper demo tomorrow because you decided that headphones were the enemy." Marcus tried to maintain his Zen persona. "Caleb, this is just a friction point. We can work through." "There is no we in a syntax error, Marcus." Caleb grabbed his bag and walked out. I sat there, documenting the scene. The masculine logic structure has collapsed under the weight of its own forced sociality. The CEO's refusal to acknowledge the necessity of private cognitive space has led to a total systemic failure. The next day, the Vesper global executives arrived. They were old-school, corporate types, men in suits who didn't care about energy or symphonies. They wanted results. The meeting was a disaster. When Marcus tried to run the demo, the screen filled with red error messages. The platform crashed 3 times. The Vesper lead, a woman who looked like she had no patience for growth mindsets, stood up. "Marcus, we hired Synergy Path because you promised a streamlined, high-tech solution. This looks like a high school science project. If you can't even get the login screen to work, why would we trust you with our global data? We've had some cultural shifts that," Marcus started. "I don't care about your culture," she snapped. "I care about my ROI. We're pulling the contract. You'll hear from our legal team about the exit clauses." The loss of Vesper Global was the beginning of the end. Within 48 hours, the board of directors, who were even more patriarchal than Marcus, though I hadn't met them, began an emergency audit. The productivity reports were leaked. Output had dropped by 80% in the 2 weeks since the Sound of Success policy was implemented. The spontaneous collaboration Marcus touted had resulted in exactly 0 new ideas and approximately 400 hours of wasted time. By Friday, there were whispers of layoffs. The office was quiet now, not the productive silence of focus, but the heavy, stagnant silence of a sinking ship. I should have felt triumphant. I had predicted this. I had seen the design flaw in Marcus's masculinity, his need to dominate the very air his employees breathed. But as I sat in the break room, I saw Leo packing his things. He had been laid off along with 3 others from the dev team. "Sorry, Leo," I said, though I made sure my voice lacked any unnecessary warmth. Leo looked at me. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. "You know, Abby, you spent the whole time watching us like we were insects in a jar. Did you ever think about actually helping? Maybe telling Marcus how much we were struggling before the demo?" "I am an intern, Leo. I don't have the structural power to." "You have a mouth," he said, cutting me off. "You talk a lot about ethics and community, but you didn't do a thing for the people right next to you. You just took notes." He walked out. I felt a slight prick of something, not guilt, because guilt is a social construct used to control women, but perhaps a sense of narrative discomfort. I went back to my desk and opened my laptop. I had a draft of my report ready to send to my supervisor at the Praxis Foundation. But then I received an email from the foundation. "Dear Abby, we have reviewed your recent ethics audit of Synergy Path Solutions. While your theoretical framework is robust, we are concerned about the lack of actionable empathy in your methodology. Our organization prides itself on fostering resilience, not just documenting failure. Given your feedback from the site supervisor, we feel this placement is no longer a fit. We wish you luck in your future academic pursuits." Marcus had complained about me. Or perhaps it was the HR director I had lectured on internalized misogyny the week before. Either way, I was out. I went home to my studio. It was a perfectly curated space, minimalist, ethically sourced furniture, a shelf full of books with titles like The Tyranny of the Normal and Abolish the Office. I made myself a cup of fair trade tea and sat by the window. I opened my phone and went to my group chat with my friends from the university. Abby just got kicked out of the internship. The patriarchy couldn't handle the truth. Marcus is a classic fragile ego, asterisk. I waited for the likes, the yes queen comments, the validation. 10 minutes passed. An hour. Finally, Sarah, a girl I'd known since freshman year, replied. Asterisk Sarah, honestly, Abby, we're kind of over the reports. We went out for drinks last night and didn't invite you because we knew you'd just spend 2 hours deconstructing the problematic nature of the bar's decor or the way the waiter said hello. We just wanted to have a drink. You're becoming impossible to be around. Asterisk. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. I looked around my ament. It was so clean. So correct. There was no one here to leave a dish in the sink, no one to make a microaggressive comment, no one to challenge my theories. I had created a perfect world of one. I thought about the office. I thought about the sound of the sales bell and the way Caleb's face looked when he was coding, that rare moment of human intensity. I had analyzed it all, categorized it, and judged it. I had been so busy being a radical ethical auditor that I had audited myself right out of the human experience. I picked up my laptop to start a new post for my patriarchy report, but the cursor just blinked at me. The white screen was blinding. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to say. There was no noise to critique. No emotional labor to calculate. There was just the silence. And in that silence, I realized that the auditory panopticon wasn't the office. It was me. I was the one watching, the one judging, the one refusing to listen. I had won. I had reached a state of total, ethical purity. I was the most aware person I knew. And I was absolutely, devastatingly alone. I looked at the phone again. No new messages. No one was coming over. No one was calling. I had deconstructed every bridge I had ever built until there was nothing left but the raw, jagged materials of my own ego. I walked over to my record player, a vintage piece I'd bought to support local artisans, and put on a record of ambient rain sounds. It was the only thing I could stand to listen to. No voices. No opinions. No humanity. I sat back down in my chair and watched the city lights through the window. Somewhere out there, people were making mistakes. They were being problematic. They were laughing too loud, using the wrong terminology, and failing to acknowledge their privilege. They were messy and loud and deeply, tragically connected. I was perfect. I was correct. I was uncompromised. The rain on the record looped, a rhythmic, artificial hiss that filled the room. It was a sound of my own choosing, a sound I could control. But as the hours passed, the control felt more and more like a cage. The silence of the office had been a disaster for productivity, but the silence of my life was a disaster for the soul. I realized then that Marcus and I weren't that different. He wanted to force a symphony to satisfy his ego, and I wanted to force a purity to satisfy mine. We both viewed people as variables in our own grand theories. We both ignored the reality of the individual in favor of the vision. I reached for my phone to apologize to Sarah, to tell her I missed her, that I could just be a person for an evening without being a sociological observer. But my thumb hovered over the screen. What would I even say? I'm sorry for being right. I'm sorry for holding you to a high standard. Even my apologies felt like an audit. I put the phone face down on the table. The blue light faded. The room returned to its sterile, ethical dimness. I stayed there for a long time, a 21-year-old girl with a degree's worth of theory and a lifetime's worth of loneliness, listening to the sound of fake rain in an empty room. The sound of success was a lie, but the sound of purity was a vacuum. And in a vacuum, nothing, not even a radical voice, can be heard. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it sounded like when the office was loud. I tried to remember the violence of the laughter, the aggression of the coffee machine, the silos of the headphones. It was annoying. It was chaotic. It was imperfect. It was alive. And as I sat in my silent, perfect ament, I realized I would give anything to hear Caleb scream at Marcus one more time. I would give anything to be back in the auditory panopticon, surrounded by the beautiful, messy, problematic noise of people who hadn't yet given up on each other. But I had made my choice. I had audited the world until it was empty. And now the audit was complete. The results were in. I was the only one left. I stood up, walked to the record player, and lifted the needle. The hiss stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the perfect silence I had always advocated for. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I went to bed, the light from my phone occasionally flickering with a notification I no longer had the energy to analyze. I was Abby. I was 21. I was a sociologist without a society. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to be right. I just wanted to be heard. But there was no one left to listen. The next morning, I woke up and followed my routine. I made my coffee. I checked the news. I looked at my ethics audit draft. I deleted it. I deleted the whole file. I deleted the daily patriarchy report folder. I walked out of my AUDITS and headed toward the coffee shop for my shift. I walked through the city, and for once, I didn't count the manspreaders on the train. I didn't analyze the gendered marketing on the billboards. I just looked at the people. When I got to the shop, a man came in. He looked tired. He was wearing headphones, big, bulky ones. He looked like a developer. "What can I get for you?" I asked. "Large black coffee," he said, his voice muffled as he slid one ear cup off. "Rough morning." I looked at him. I could have told him about the colonial history of coffee. I could have critiqued his use of the word rough as a form of emotional dumping. I could have stayed silent and cold. Instead, I did something radical. "I get it," I said. "The world is pretty loud today, isn't it?" He looked at me surprised. He gave me a small, genuine smile. Yeah, it really is." "Enjoy your coffee," I said. He put his headphones back on, retreated into his silo, and walked out. I watched him go. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a data point. It was just a moment. And for the first time in a long time, it was enough. I went back to the espresso machine, the steam wand hissing, the grinder roaring, the customers chatting. The noise was constant. The noise was overwhelming. I didn't try to audit it. I just let it be. Because the alternative, the silence, was a price I was no longer willing to pay. I am Abby. I am 21. And I am learning how to listen to the world, even when it doesn't sound the way I want it to. I realized that the most radical thing I could do wasn't to judge the world from a distance, but to inhabit it, flaws and all. The silent office had been a disaster because it tried to force a connection that wasn't there. My ethical purity had been a disaster because it destroyed the connections that were. As the lunch rush began, the shop filled with voices. It was a cacophony. It was a mess. It was a symphony of the unsynchronized. I took a deep breath, leaned over the counter, and asked the next person in line what they wanted. And this time, I actually listened to the answer. The internship was gone. My friends were gone. My status as an ethical icon was crumbling. But as I stood there in the middle of the noise, I didn't feel like a failure. I felt like a human being. And for a girl who had spent her whole life trying to be a theory, being a human being was the hardest and most important work I had ever done. The auditory panopticon was finally closed. I had stepped out of the tower. The world was loud. And for the first time, I was okay with that. I worked through the rest of my shift, the sounds of the shop washing over me. I didn't write anything in my notebook. I didn't file any reports. I just made coffee. When my shift was over, I walked out into the afternoon sun. I put on my own headphones. I turned on a podcast about something I knew nothing about, something unpolitical, something frivolous. I walked home, just another person in the crowd, lost in my own silo, perfectly, beautifully unavailable. I was Abby. And I was finally finding my own sound. The story of the silent office would be told in business journals and sociology classes as a cautionary tale of management overreach. But for me, it was something else. It was the moment the mirror broke. And in the broken pieces, I finally saw myself. Not a radical ethical auditor. Just a girl. In a very, very loud world. And that, I decided, was exactly where I wanted to be. I reached my AUDITS door, took off my headphones, and listened to the sound of the hallway, the hum of the elevator, the muffled television from 4B, the distant siren from the street. It was the sound of life. I turned the key, stepped inside, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to change a single thing. The audit was over. The life had begun.